I am going to invite your panelists, your guests, back onto screen now, if that's okay with them, because David very kindly has opened up his book launch to his guests this evening for a discussion, which I think is going to be really good. So before we get going on that, Sean and David, Michelle Houlihan has left a lovely comment saying, thank you to David and Sean for putting real bullets into subject matter that is too often prettied up. So I just wanted to share that with you. Okie dokie. David, do you have anything that you want to start the discussion off with?
Well, I just wanted, I'm so grateful and honored that everybody would take time today to join us. And I didn't, I wanted this to be more of a talk about crime fiction in general. Thank you so much for asking me questions about winter counts, but a panel this distinguished doesn't happen that often. And so I just wanted to throw some questions out there, because to let people kind of weigh in, and so some of the questions that I had, would be, what are the essential elements of a good crime novel, of a great crime novel? What are we all working with? What are some of the things that we're writing with to, that really make a great crime novel? So I was just hoping to get a little bit of a discussion going in general.
Does anybody, do I have to be like a teacher and pick on you, or does somebody just want to go for it?
I'll jump in first and say, I always feel like a good crime novel has three main elements. Somebody's been wrong, somebody's upset about that person being wrong, or something's been wrong, and somebody's going to do something about it. And I think those are the foundational infrastructure, I guess, for a good crime novel, which is a little bit different than a straight up mystery or a cozy mystery, I think. One of my favorite writers, Dennis Lehane, says that a great crime or noir novel is about not about people falling from great heights. It's about people falling from the curb into the gutter, and I think that's true. So I think you have to have a narrative propulsion to the story, and I think you have to have characters who are willing to step outside of the law to achieve their goals. So that's what I always start with. So.
Anybody going to volunteer, or we're going to have to pick on you? Rod, go on.
Oh man, I've got thoughts on this. Yeah, that's a really interesting answer there from Sean, actually. I think so. There's a couple of things that work for me. I'm a big fiend in my own reading for setting. I love settings where you can really feel like the author has just transported you to that place and knows it and taken you there. I love that aspect of reading. But for me, it's character, and I know it's a slight cliche, but it's that thing of a plot on its own for me doesn't do anything for me. It leaves me empty. It's like a chocolate bar. You eat it, you kind of feel a bit sick about it afterwards, and it's kind of, you wish you hadn't done it. Whereas if you've got good characters, you'll follow them anywhere. And it's that cliche of if you've got good characters, you'll watch them, you'll read about them go to the laundrette, you'll read about them go and do their shopping. Who cares? Because they're good and they're interesting and they're real and they feel real. And to me, that's where it always comes from. It's feeling like you're looking at, and I guess it goes back to Sean's point, it's feeling about real people with real problems that you can empathize with what they're having to address and how they're going to address them. And obviously in crime novels, you then take it that one step further, which is normally that problem involves, someone on the business end of a gun. So that's it for me.
I think for me, Rod's hit the nail on the head to a degree with the character side of things as well. I think if your readers don't care about your character, then you're off to a losing start right from the beginning. They've got to care what happens to them. They've got to want them to achieve their goals and their aims. And if you don't establish that quite early on, you're in danger of people kind of putting the book down. Then the other thing that I always try and bear in mind as well is, as a reader, not just as a writer as well, I like books that are written in quite a cinematic kind of way. Ones that I can see and taste and touch. I need them to leap off the page. So for me, it's all around really kind of making it as 3D as possible, not just the people, but as you said, Rod, the setting itself. The setting for me should be as much of a character as the actual people who are walking around the stage.
And I'm probably going to really embarrass David by saying this, but I really felt like the Rosebud Reservation was a character in Winter Counts. It really was. He captured the setting for me perfectly. Having never been on a reservation, I feel like if I was any good at drawing, I could draw it all out for you in a map, and I could tell you about who lived where and what they were doing and all of that. So yeah, I think you've really captured that for me, David. James, do you have anything to add for essential elements, or has everyone taken your ideas?
Well, I could just say, yeah, everybody's taken my ideas. I thought exactly the same thing as everybody else. But yeah, there are characters, the suspense, you need the reader to sort of want to follow your character, want to follow your plot, want to follow, you know, what happens to your main character and those associates. I write about Australia, so setting is a huge part of my novel. So, creating that sort of area, Western Australia, creating the sort of towns and area and remoteness of characters who enter and what happens to them. So I would say suspense is, I try and create an element of suspense in my novels.
I have to say as well, in terms of setting, you, for both your books, James, you absolutely nailed that.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
It's so hard to capture, isn't it, though? Just that essence of a place. Like, you know, I've read Sean's books and I don't know the area that, I've not been to the area where they're set, but I feel like I've been there now. And the same certainly with David's book. And it's just so hard, though, to know. You can't, you know, if someone said to me, what is it about that encapsulates it and captures that setting? I couldn't put it into words.
It's funny because I when I first started writing, I did not think anyone would be interested in the area where I come from. I mean, maybe David can attest to this too. When you come from a small town or an area where you're mired in poverty, there's a certain amount of you don't want to write in a way that's curiosity seeking. You know, you don't want to write in a way that's watching a car wreck. You know, I wanted to present the area I came from with respect. And like David said, you know, I come from the Deep South, and a lot of people have a lot of preconceived notions about the American Deep South. And, you know, I try to dispel those as well as best I could. And so for a long time, I felt very unsure about writing from that, in that setting and in that atmosphere. What eventually happened was I got a big case of the, I'm going to censor myself. I got a big case of the efforts, and nothing else I was writing was selling. And so I said, well, I'm going to write what I know best, which is moonshine and pickup trucks and fighting and, hiding in cornfields. And so that's where the setting came from. But I wanted to say something about, I wanted to speak to, ask my own question if I could. Anybody that's read my books have a lot of violence. There's a lot of violence. I try my best to make sure it's not gratuitous. And I wanted to ask David and the rest of the panel, what's your line, or what is your parameters for the violence in your books? And are there lines that you won't cross? I know what mine are, but I wanted to hear some other people's answers if that was possible.
I'll jump in on this. My book is, trigger warning. If you've read it, it's pretty much exceptionally violent. So I won't give too much away. So I don't have a lot of lines on violence per se. I do have a personal line that my partner and I, she's also a writer, we talk about a lot. I will not portray violence against a child. Now, I do have a child that froze to death in my book, but I don't show that child dying. It happened in the past. It happened in a flashback. And even there, I was a little bit uncomfortable. So for me, that is a line. In fact, I won't even read it. I'm reading a collection of short stories right now, and I just had to put it down because as a dad, I just can't read it. And so that's my line. So I'll stop there.
I think for me, I've got a similar kind of line in that respect. So my most recent book, my third book, does have an element of violence against children in the past, but it's more referred to and reflected on rather than in the moment. I think in terms of violence in general, it's all about context, right? If it's right for the characters and the setting, and it's done in as tasteful a way as you can, but it's got to make your characters and what they do feel authentic, right? So I know if you ask my mum the same question, she's walked out of movies before. She walked out of Pulp Fiction. She did make a few comments about my fourth book, about the opening to that, and said I didn't think any of my children could write something like that. Now, to me, it wasn't that bad. I've read a lot worse, but it was absolutely what was needed for that scene and the people involved in that scene. So I didn't have any kind of issues writing it because it was right time, right place, right context.
Do you know, I think that's nailed it. And so for me, as both as a reader and like watching films, I'm not particularly spooked by gore. I can take it and leave it. But as a writer, I do try and leave it off the page. And I do honestly think that one well-placed punch is worth as much as, 1,000 bullets sometimes. But interestingly, I think it's, as you said, Rob, it's about context, because it's funny that you say, David, that your book is exceptionally violent, because that wasn't my takeaway from it. That wasn't my perception of it. And actually thinking back now, I can think, yes, there are very violent scenes, and I get why you say that, but it didn't strike me at any point as gratuitous or anything like that, because it was A, as Rob says, in the right place and in the right time, and B, I believed in the characters that were doing it, and in some cases I wanted them to inflict that violence, so I was kind of fine with it. And it's, I've been rewatching one of my favorite shows, The Wire, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, and there's some incredibly gratuitous stuff in there, but it's appropriate for the characters and the scene and the place and the time and for the message that it's trying to convey. And that was something that I took from your book, David.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree with Rod that if it sometimes the violence is needed in the book, and sometimes it can be told as an off-screen. It doesn't need to be shown. And if you did show it, it would just end up being a gratuitous sort of what do they call it, torture porn sort of scene that you're just writing it just to have it in there to gain clicks. For example, mine, I try in both books to keep the violence off the screen mostly, but there are other sort of novellas that I've written, one in the Vietnam War, that is very violent, and that's just what is needed for it. So again, I just agree. If it's needed, if the character would be that violent and needs to be that violent, then fine, show it.
I always think it's.
I guess I'll answer my own question, because my line is I don't hurt animals, and I don't like to depict violence against children. But I say that, and I'm working on a serial killer novel right now about a serial killer who kills like teenagers. So I guess but it's all gonna be off screen. It's gonna be off screen. But with Razor Blade Tears, it was significantly more violent than Blacktop Wasteland, because in the premise of Razor Blade Tears is two fathers have lost their sons. Their sons have been murdered. And like what everybody else has said, contextually, I felt the violence was well placed, because these men don't know how to communicate any other way except violence. They're both ex-convicts. They both lived a violent life, and the worst thing that could ever happen to them has happened. And so the only way that they can express that is dealing out the violence in kind that was dealt to their sons. That being said, the first chapter of Winter Counts, when Virgil picks up the teeth, it didn't get on my nerves. I have a strong constitution for that, but I was like, oh wow, we're in some serious territory now. He's got teeth in his pocket. I just got changed. So anyway, I just wanted to ask that question. Thank you.
I think the one about the point that you make about animals, Sean, is an interesting one from a reader's point of view, because I've spoken to so many writers who have killed so many people in some horrific ways, and then they have one scene where something happens to a dog or a cat, and that is what gets all of the readers' hackles up. They come for you. There was a colleague of mine, I think it was 2 books back, she did something similar, and she got so much negative feedback from readers. Great book, but that's the one thing that they zeroed in on.
I wanted to talk about representation of marginalised communities and characters in crime fiction. I think Sean and David have touched on that slightly in terms of writing what you know. But in terms of, for example, this is an all-male panel, so would any of you guys write from a female perspective, for example? Or do you feel, particularly Rod, Rob and James, that you don't have the background to write somebody that hasn't had a similar life to you?
I think in terms of... Oh, go on, James, you go first.
Oh, sorry, I was about to say Vanished does have a female lead detective who is sort of a mixed race, South African and English. And so that is obviously a perspective that I'm not familiar with, but that was the character that sort of jumped out at me when I started to write it, that she felt like an outsider in Australia from sort of where she grew up, and she works sort of in quite remote sort of places and communities where she also feels like an outsider. So, so it's all about developing that character as you write the book or before you write the book, to have a sense of who they are, sort of have a sense for what sort of their struggle growing up might have been. And but again, you have to be very sensitive about, about not sort of stereotyping, about not sort of immediately sort of panning it this way or that way, because every character in your book is a unique person that you put through some terrible sort of trauma that you love, and then you also destroy. But yeah.
Was there ever a moment, and this is really for James and Rod, where you were writing women and you were like, oh, I just don't know about that, or I'm not sure, or I'm worried about how that's going to come across? Or
I'll let Rod answer that one.
Thanks, mate. Cheers. Thank you, James, for that hospital pass. So it's an interesting one. One of my favourite answers, or my favourite answer I've ever seen to this question, and I forget the author, so forgive me, whoever it was, but he was asked about writing a female character as a man, and he said, "Well, the thing is, it's a lot like writing people."
Yeah, that's fair.
Fair point. It's an interesting one. I was less daunted writing my current novel, which has a female detective as the protagonist, Casey Ray. I was less daunted writing that because it's set in the present day in an area that I have roughly been to and am vaguely familiar with in Long Island, than I was in writing my first book, which is set in Texarkana in the States with a male protagonist, but in 1946. Okay. Which, despite my my appearance, I was not alive at that time, and I had never been to that particular part of the States. So that was quite daunting, and I'm not sure I'd have done it if it hadn't been my debut and I hadn't been too stupid to think about the consequences of what I was embarking upon. And actually, with the latest one, yes, of course, with every book, and I'm sure the other guys will say the same, everything you write, you fear, every single aspect of it. Am I getting the character right? Am I getting the setting right? So yes, there were concerns about making sure that I represent Casey's journey and her experience in a male-dominated police force, but I wouldn't say any more so than everything else you try and get right in a book. And particularly for me, it was like police procedure, for example. I was almost more worried about getting that right than being able to represent a woman. Now, you might read the book and say, well, that's because you've got it all wrong, but what can you do?
Well, it is fiction, in fairness, so if anybody has that comeback, you just say, well, it is fiction.
I think it's about getting the authenticity behind the voice, isn't it? Mm-hmm. And making sure that it's distinctly different and it's right for that person. So albeit the series that I've had out so far, the first 4 books have a male lead character, but the book I've got out on submission at the moment with my agent is that has a female lead. So I wouldn't honestly say I found that any more challenging, really. It was probably something I was a little bit more conscious of when I started. I got my wife to be an early proofreader, and I just said, look, if I don't make a convincing woman, you need to tell me early, so I can look to change this a little bit. But she says it went down all right, and yeah, hopefully we'll find a home for that one soon. If as a little aside, if anyone wants, I say a laugh, it's quite cringy. If you look on Twitter for the hashtag of men who write women, you will see some of the worst examples ever.
Oh man, for me, I tend to try to write all my characters by figuring out what they want and what do they need, and so you hope that you're doing the right by them and you're being, like you said, the authenticity, the voice is correct. I will say this though, with Razorblade Tears, because I was writing several characters that are LGBTQ, I did reach out to friends of mine who identify as LGBTQ to make sure I was getting things right, that I wasn't writing caricatures, that I was writing actual characters. And I think that's the mistake that some people made. Like James said, you don't want to write a bunch of stereotypes. And if you feel uncomfortable with a character, or you don't feel like you know enough about a character, there's nothing wrong with researching, and trying to make sure that you're giving that person the proper voice. Just as an aside, I'll give you an example. When I wrote Razorblade Tears and I had somebody read the first draft, there's a scene at a bar that's mostly populated by LGBTQ folks, and a fight breaks out. And in the initial draft, I had the patrons of the bar very solemnly look at the person who started the fight, and it was almost like the whole shame thing on Game of Thrones. And my friend, the great writer PJ Vernon, who identifies as LGBTQ, he said, "Hey man, not for nothing." He said, but when there's a fight at a gay bar, it's like a fight at every other bar. People are getting out of the way. Somebody doesn't want to get their drink knocked over. People are looking. Somebody's taking pictures. He said, we're not all these. He said, we're not all these solemn monks handing out, withering looks. And that was a lesson for me as a writer, where I thought I was doing something really great by creating that scene, but it was a scene I wanted to create. It wasn't a scene that was natural to the story, and I think that's the biggest thing. You have to write scenes that are natural and contextual to the story you're telling, regardless of the character's background.
And I'll just jump in quickly and say, I do have a major character in Winter Counts, Marie Shortbear, but in the sequel, I am really delighted to announce, I think it's the first time I've announced it ever, I'm introducing a major new character who is female in the book, and I'm having a blast writing her. So we'll see how effective I was. So I'll just leave it there.
Excellent, thank you. We usually only do an hour, but we're having so much fun here that we're just going to crack on if everybody else is happy to continue staying for a chat. We have some other questions from our audience and from our lovely Simon, who's been helping us out behind the scenes. Simon would like to know, bear with me a sec, who are your favourite writers working today? Can see, having 5 authors on may have grown some to be read lists already. So people in the audience might have already added a lot of books to their list to read tonight, but I think we should just carry on and talk about our favourite writers, if that's okay. David, it's your book launch. You go first.
Well, I always love this question so much. Who are some of my favorite writers and who am I reading right now? I just want to say in the U.S. right now, Sean and I are both members of a group called Crime Writers of Color, and we are just delighted to see the amazing success that's happening right now. Rachel Housel Hall, Kelly Garrett, they're just amazing writers. PJ Vernon, who you've just mentioned, who's not of color, but LGBTQ, has an amazing book, Bathhouse. Right now there's just so much amazing stuff that's happening. The classics for me would be Jim Thompson, Raymond Chandler. I mean, I was influenced by them. Agatha Christie. I loved those cozy. I read them as a kid. But right now there's just, I think, an explosion of truly wonderful work that's coming out all across the globe. So I'll leave it there.
James. Sorry.
Sean, go ahead. You've an answer prepared. I don't.
No.
I was just going to say to echo David, of course, my foundation are the great writers of the past. So it's Agatha Christie, Raymond Chandler, Chester Himes, John D. McDonald, Ross McDonald, Mickey Spillane, Dorothy L. Sayers, P.D. James, folks like that. I love reading all of that. Colin Dexter, I was a huge Colin Dexter fan. Some of the stuff that I'm reading right now, the writers that I think you should be reading are really great crime writers. Like he said, he mentioned Rachel Hall and Kelly Garrett. I like to add Jennifer Hillier. Jennifer Hillier writes some of the most interesting and disturbing psychological thrillers that anybody could read today. I think they're amazing. Gigi Pandian, who writes cozy lockroom mysteries. If anybody's familiar with John Dickinson Carr, Gigi is probably the next best lockroom mystery writer that you'll ever read. I think she's amazing. 2 writers that I think people should read, or 2 books, I should say, because both of these guys aren't that prolific, but Donald Ray Pollock's The Devil All the Time is an amazing book about 1950s era central, the Midwest American experience, post-war experience. It's a crime novel and it's so much more. So I would encourage people to pick that book up. It's amazing. And of course, the guy that inspired me more than anybody else, Walter Mosley, one of the greatest writers of the 20th century, in my opinion. And you can't go wrong with an Easy Rawlins book. And also Dennis Lehane, I would like to mention him as well. He's one of the great, detective writers of the last 20 years. Darkness Take My Hand is one of his great novels that I read. I reread that book every couple of years and I always find something new in it. So that's my answer, and I'm sorry for rambling.
Not at all, thank you. Who'd like to go next?
I think we could probably spend most of the evening rattling off books we've enjoyed over the last few years, but I've had to pick a couple of writers and books that have stuck with me over the last, I would say the last 3 or 4 years in particular. Absolutely loved You by Caroline Kepnes and the series that's kind of flowed out of that. I think that is a perfect example of how to make people care about a pretty bad dude, but she still makes you root for him and still makes you care about what happens to him. And then the other one I would say is probably one of my favorite writers is Greg Iles. He's done an absolutely superb series in particular. He's done some standalones too, but a superb series set in Natchez, Mississippi that there's 3 books within that series in particular absolutely blew my socks off. And it's the kind of book that I'd finish and then just kind of sit there and go, I can't write that good. I might as well give up.
Yeah, I'll just go with that. Nobody's mentioned the classic Stephen King, but Stephen King was somebody I read a huge amount when I was growing up. I started the Count of Monte Cristo was the book, the first sort of proper adult book that I sort of read when I was 11 or 12, and put me off writing for years because it was just so in depth and so good and so fantastic. But recently, I'm reading The Divinities by Parker Bilal at the minute, which is just an immense book set in London. It's just so rich and smooth at the minute. And there's lots of authors. There's Jane Casey, Olivia Kiernan. I'm reading a lot of Australian authors. Jane Harper, our novels set in Australia at least. Jane Harper, Chris Hammer. Mark Brandy, Susan Allett. These are all just, fantastic authors writing sort of Australian crime novels at the minute.
Thank you. And finally, Rod?
Yeah, so I'm contractually obliged, I think, to mention that James Ellroy was my guy. He got me into writing. His books made me want to be a writer, and then took me backwards to his influences, which were the guys that have all been mentioned, Chandler and all those kind of people. And then a couple that I think from the States that don't get the love over here, perhaps that they do over there, and they should do. James Lee Burke, an absolute master, well known in the States, perhaps doesn't get the attention here that I think he should. And Daniel Woodrell, who I think is just, I don't think he's ever wasted a word in his life. He might be the best prose writer alive. He's a genius. And then trying to, as James said, I could rattle off names all night, as Rob said, but trying to think of recent things that I've read that I really loved. Vaseem Khan, I'm going to mention over here. His previous series, the Baby Ganesh, Inspector Ganesh books were great, but he's got a new series out now. The second book's just come out, Won a Dagger, the Malabar House series. Yeah. Vaseem's always been a great writer, but he is just at the absolute top of his game, and he's just really stepped it up. So, I'm going to say a shout out to Vas because that book was just fantastic.
Brilliant, thank you. We do have another question from our audience. Stephen Rogers would like to know, do you find it easier to write a book knowing that you will make it into a series, so in theory have more time to develop the characters, or is writing standalones just the same?
Well, I'll jump in quickly because I'm not sure that I have anything to say here, having only one book under my belt, unlike everybody else. I did have a 2-book deal with HarperCollins, but I don't know if it's going to be a series or not. I hope so. So I can't really address the issue of a standalone. So I'm going to defer to the other authors and just say, but I think the key in writing a series is to make each book stand on its own, but tie in to the last one. And I'll tell you right now, that's an issue that I'm struggling with mightily. So I will leave it there.
I think it is. It's a fine balance when you've got a series to seed book 2 with enough references to stuff that's gone in book 1, so you kind of have that continuation. But obviously, you don't want to give any spoilers away. And for each of the 4 of my series, I've had to really kind of go back with a fine-tooth comb and try and get that balance right. I don't think I found it any easier or harder because the one that's out on submission at the moment is a standalone. And I don't think it really changed the process of writing it for me. You get enough down on the page to carry that story through. Could I turn that into a series? I probably could, but I didn't feel that I held anything back as a result. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I haven't. Both my books are standalone, and so far I haven't actually written a series, which I'm attempting to write a series at the minute. So I'm in David's boat as well. I find it quite tough to actually write a series, that character arc that sort of like lasts 2, 3, 4, whatever books, and and sort of develop individual stories for each book as well. I'm finding it's quite a difficult process for me because I'm used to writing standalone where you're sort of it's like one shot, you're in, you meet the character, the story happens, and sort of you leave, and then they wander off in the distance like an old cowboy into the sunset. So I'm finding it quite difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of topsy-turvy. So my first 3 books are in a series that was never meant to be. The first book was a standalone, and then the publisher wanted to become a series, so very quickly had to kind of retool that. My 4th book was, I had in my head at least loosely that it was going to become the start of a series, and then I ended up writing something completely different, which became my 5th book. So the 4th one, that was the first one that was planned to be a series, became a standalone. The first one that was going to be a standalone became a series. The 5th one, who knows where we are with that because it's just coming out. I think the thing for me was is like David said, the optimal for me is standalones that are, sorry, a series of books that are linked but can stand on their own 2 feet. Executing that obviously is tricky, but it's not impossible. The thing that I found, for example, in my first 3 was the arc of the character that developed over the first book actually became the arc of a trilogy in the end. Mm-hmm. And what I thought was kind of his ultimate redemption at the end of the first book actually becomes a stepping stone on the path to that kind of thing. So,
Sean, would you ever consider a series?
I started writing, when I started writing, I wanted to write a series. My very first book, it's available in the States, it's not available in the UK, is a private detective story called My Darkest Prayer. And I wanted it to be a series. So I had set it up so that I was revealing secrets about the protagonist's past in each book. But in between writing the second book, I wrote Blacktop Wasteland, and that took on a whole life of its own. So what I'm doing now is sort of creating the the SA Cosby shared universe, or the SA Cosby verse, because I like dropping cameos from characters from previous works or previous short stories into conversations in the book. Like there's a character called Skunk that is referenced in Blacktop Wasteland that appears in a short story and also appears in Darkest Prayer. And then in Razorblade, there's a character named Shade who's referenced, who appears in other works. So I'm kind of doing this kind of interdependent shared universe. So, but I've considered going back and retooling and continuing that series. So we'll see. I think the difficulty is, like everybody else has said, that you want to reveal just enough about the character to make each individual book interesting without telling the entire tale in one tome. So, absolutely. And my cat wants to.
I've got a couple of really quick fire questions, but before I do that, for those of you in the audience who haven't been reading the chat, that's totally fine. But to be in with a chance of winning a copy of Winter Counts, the fabulous Winter Counts, email baytales20@gmail.com. All one word, baytales20@gmail.com. Put Winter Counts in the subject line and answer this very simple question. It will be simple if you've been listening. What's the name of the reservation where Virgil lives? Right, guys, really quick question. Plotting or pantsing? Sean, you're laughing, you're going first.
I am I'm in between. I write a little bit of plot and then I kind of extrapolate from that. So I couldn't do just pantsing because I'm terribly unorganized.
James.
Yeah, I've been a plotter for ages, but then the last sort of book that I attempted to write, I just pantsed it, and I actually quite enjoyed doing it. So now I don't know what I am.
Rod.
Reluctant plotter here. I've done more, started as a pantser, done more plotting with each book, and found that it helps. But I do still like to write myself into a corner sometimes, and then try and figure out how I'm going to get out of it.
Rob.
I'm firmly in the middle, so I'm neither plotter nor pantser, more of a planter. I need to know where it starts and ends, and I'll generally have like a 1 or 2 sentence per chapter to kind of guide me. but it does change quite a bit once I get into the mix. But I have to have that kind of skeleton to start with.
And the man of the hour, David.
I'm an enthusiastic plotter. In fact, I make my students, I teach at a couple of creative writing programs, and I make them read a book called Save the Cat. I make them read it, and I make them outline their projects, because I find that often they haven't really thought this through, and they all love the book. I haven't yet had a student who doesn't love the book. So because I'm trying to raise 2 kids and work and everything else, if I don't have an outline going, I'm in deep trouble. So I would say enthusiastically plotter.
I've actually got that one to read.
David, I'm sorry to tell you, I've read Save the Cat, and I'm the first one.
Wow.
There you go.
The first bad book recommendation of the evening.
Sorry. So unless anybody has, I nearly missed a question. Oh, it's not a question, it's a comment from Michelle. Michelle says, 2 thumbs up for your audio narrators. Most of her reading is done via audio books, and she thinks the narrators are fantastic. So thank you very much for that. Unless there are any more questions, I am going to thank you all and let you go off and enjoy your evening/afternoon, depending on where you are. So huge thank you to Simon Buick behind the scenes for keeping everything going and asking us a question that has probably bankrupted all of our viewers for all of those fantastic book recommendations. Buy local, shop indie if you can. Thank you to James Delargy, SA Cosby. Why do I keep getting it wrong? It's SA Cosby. How rude. Rod Reynolds and Robert Scragg for appearing with us. Honestly, man. Thank you to everybody in the audience for your lovely comments, for your excellent questions, and massive thanks and huge congratulations to David, Heska, Wanbli, Weiden. May Winter Counts be as successful in the UK as it has been in the US. And for everybody in the audience, if you've got friends who want to watch a thoroughly fantastic panel, this recording will be up in the next couple of days, so please do visit baytales.com and tell your friends to too. Thank you everybody for joining us tonight, and congratulations, David.
Thank you all so much.
Pleasure.
Thanks everyone, good night.
Very